All right, folks, how you doing? Welcome back. So this is the religions of Scotland. Did Presbyterianism have crypto-Jewish origins? Part 3. Disclaimer, under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Once again, this is a brief kind of Reader's Digest summary version of when Scotland was Jewish. Don't use this as a replacement for the book. Get the book. The links are in the description. This is not a substitute for the book. This presentation is used to promote it, to encourage people to acquire it, because this is a really, really good book. An absolute essential, I would say, in the top 3 of must-have books. So, very Old Testament. The books of Daniel, Psalms, and Exodus were amongst Knox's favourite texts. He was very anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish, can't possibly imagine why, and he despised Mary Queen of Scots and Queen Mary of England. He once chucked a painting of the Virgin Mary in the river in disgust. Jeez. You talk about sexists and misogynists. Knox didn't approve of women as monarchs. I don't think he approved of women in general, even calling Queen Mary of England the mistress of Satan. His sermons were very Old Testament in character. He equated his congregation with the ancient Israelites, and he pushed for Mosaic law to rule over Scotland. Remember this when you go back and you watch the Edinburgh Jerusalem presentations that I did with Jed Skeptic, and also when I do the Silurian Wars with Rome, chapters out of The Great Deception by Beaumont. Everything Beaumont says in Britain, the Key to World History, or The Great Deception. Remember all this in the back of your head when you're reading something like this from when Scotland was Jewish, because the connections are there. I'm not saying Beaumont was right or wrong. It's up to you to make your own mind up on that. I'm just saying, when you read that and then you compare it with that, as David Icke likes to say, connect the dots. Very interesting. A new Israel. So Knox also pushed for the death penalty for crimes such as blasphemy, perjury, murder, and adultery. Knox also pushed for universal education in Scotland, which made her one of the most literate nations in the world. He also pushed for the care of the poor, ill, and disabled, which would result in a society on earth which mirrored heaven itself, a metaphor echoed from Kabbalistic French ideas. By the mid-17th century, the Scottish Parliament had enforced strict Sabbatarianism, which forbade drinking, dancing, music, washing, or working on the Sabbath. Now, interestingly, I'm going to share something with you here. So this is from the BBC website, the 24 quotes on Holyrood's wall. The very first quote, the very first one, number 1 that comes up. Psalm 19:14, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my redeemer. So that's quote number 1 on the wall on the Scottish Parliament. So, keep this in mind. Just little things, little things really tell the story. And then you're reading here, the Scottish Parliament in the mid-17th century enforced Sabbatarianism. The singing of psalms. So Knox created strict guidelines for training ministers as they were to study theology, Hebrew, mathematics, physics, economics, ethics, and moral philosophy. We've seen this with Aberdeen before. The Judaic Colony in Aberdeen presentation talks about all this. This curriculum was patterned more on Jewish Islamic methods from Spain and France than any Christian education system, the book points out. Knox also pushed for the singing of psalms during Sabbath service, daily morning and evening prayers in the household, and for parents to instruct God's law. Of Abraham's loins. So Knox married Marjorie Bowes from Beauvais, French Jews, and their children were named Nathaniel and Eleazar, which the book points out were hardly traditional Christian names. As Marjorie was dying in 1560, she was said to have told her sons to, quote, be as true worshippers of God that ever sprang out of Abraham's loins. I mean, you talk about Old Testament, doesn't really get much more Old Testament than that. Scotland's leading minister. So Knox remarried Marjorie Stuart a few years later. He was 54 and she was 17. By the way, you ought to see the faces of the feminists when you tell them this. That sets them off something fucking awful. It triggers the fuck out of them when they hear stuff like this. But again, as I always say, you need to look deeper. Look again. Margaret was highborn. The book goes on to emphasize that Knox was Scotland's leading minister, or essentially rabbi in all but name, and that his marriage to Scotland's ruling royal house of Davidic blood makes sense. The authors state that whereas they cannot definitely make the case that John Knox and John Calvin were Sephardic crypto Jews by blood, the circumstantial evidence is strong enough to make a compelling argument. So, my personal motto, if I were to adopt one, would be look again, like with Dundas, for example. Why did Knox marry this young girl who was 17 years old? What was her name? Margaret Stewart? Was it because he was a terrible sexist and a terrible misogynist and he looked down on women and all this? By today's standards, absolutely. But was he marrying a 17-year-old girl because he was a terrible sexist? No, that wasn't the main reason. The reason is presented here. The authors have, underscored the real reason because she was of the royal house of Davidic blood. And Knox was, the head rabbi. So it was as much political as anything else, really. It was nothing to do with sexism or misogyny and it was because he was marrying in with the royal bloodline. It's more political than anything else, really. So the Protestant Reformation movement, hang on, I'll move myself out of the way. The authors point out that the great irony that in attempting to destroy Judaism, the Spanish Inquisition spectacularly backfired, as the Iberian Sephardic Jews in their exile wound up fostering and creating the Protestant Reformation movement all across Europe in places such as Holland, France, Britain, Switzerland, and of course, Germany. So there you go. They ended up creating the very thing that they were trying to destroy. Spectacularly blew up in their face. They created the Reformation through persecution, essentially. So, anyway, that wraps up this series. Hope you enjoyed it. Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I'll see you the next time.